Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. We're tackling a pretty heavy topic this time around, the conflict in Beirut, Lebanon. You guys sent in a ton of articles and reports, and it's clear things are pretty intense over there.
Yeah, we're talking airstrikes, displacement,
The whole
really the whole nine yards. What we want to do today is look past the headlines and, really get a sense of what this conflict means for the people who are living through it.
right.
Not just the numbers and the casualties, but the human impact.
Exactly. Like, what is daily life actually like right now for people who are stuck in this crisis? We'll look at the challenges, their resilience.
And what it all means in the bigger picture.
Okay, so our sources this time take us right into the thick of it to a neighborhood in South Beirut called Dahieh.
Dahi.
It's described as a Hezbollah stronghold and a focal point for a lot of the Israeli airstrikes. They paint a really stark picture.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that Dahi is more than just a battleground, right? Yeah, it's a community with a complex social fabric, and Hezbollah's presence there. It plays a significant role in people's everyday lives, even beyond the conflict.
Right, so we're not talking about just like a militant group holed up somewhere. These guys run social services, schools.
Healthcare facilities, even,
Right.
which makes the situation even more complicated for aid organizations and first responders who are trying to operate in that kind of environment.
Yeah, speaking of first responders, we actually have accounts from two firefighters working in Dahieh, Ghassan Ziheim and Aman Tower.
Yeah.
Everybody calls him Fire.
Fire.
Ziheim, he's a veteran firefighter.
Okay.
And he really lays out the devastation, talking about how a lot of these targets seem to be civilian buildings, not military facilities.
Yeah, and that raises some serious questions, about the intended targets.
Yeah.
And the potential for collateral damage. Like the fact that a warehouse full of domestic appliances was hit by a missile.
It's like, what?
Yeah, it makes you think, yeah, right, was this a strategic target or was it something else? I mean, this kind of incident can have massive economic consequences for local businesses and make it even harder for civilians to get basic necessities.
Right. It's like, what was the military objective there? And then you have Taher, Fire, and his story really hit me hard. This guy lost his own home in the airstrikes. He's living in a car park with his whole team.
Wow.
But he's still out there every day leading the rescue efforts.
That's, it's incredibly inspiring, but it also makes you think about the psychological toll this takes on these first responders. I mean, they're facing trauma on a daily basis, both personally and professionally. How do you even cope with witnessing that kind of devastation and loss, especially when you're also a victim of the conflict yourself?
Yeah, it really makes you think about what it takes to keep going in a situation like that. And then there are the civilians, the people living under the constant threat of these airstrikes. Our sources talk about evacuation warnings coming in the middle of the night, families forced to just grab whatever they can and flee. There's this one quote from a resident who refused to evacuate. He said, "He who flees his home will know humiliation."
Wow.
Powerful statement about the ties people have to their homes, even when they become dangerous.
Yeah, that quote really highlights the impossible choices people are facing. Leaving your home means facing so much uncertainty, right? Potential displacement, loss of everything familiar. But staying puts you and your loved ones at risk. There are no easy answers.
And it's not just a few families we're talking about here. The sources say over 1 million people have been displaced.
A million.
Almost a fifth of Lebanon's entire population.
Wow.
That's families sleeping on the ground in Martyr Square, children trying to build some semblance of a home out of polystyrene,
Polystyrene.
all while fearing their homes might not even exist anymore.
The scale of displacement is just staggering, and it raises a whole host of concerns. Are there enough resources to provide shelter, food, and medical care for all these people? What are the long-term consequences for their physical and mental health? How will this affect their education, their jobs, their sense of community? I mean, these are all critical questions that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
And, it's not just the physical dangers they're dealing with, it's the psychological impact. Imagine that constant fear, never knowing when the next airstrike might hit.
Right, and the sources definitely touch on that. They talk about the anxiety, sleeplessness, the feeling of just being constantly on edge. One minute you're having dinner with your family, the next you're like running for your lives.
Right, and you don't even know if you'll ever see your home again.
Exactly.
It's like their whole lives are turned upside down.
Yeah.
Their sense of security just shattered. And even if they manage to evacuate, they're left wondering about their homes, their belongings, their neighbors. The sources mention families being separated in the chaos, people losing contact with loved ones, not knowing if they're safe or even alive. It's a level of uncertainty and stress that's hard to even fathom.
And then there's the fear of what happens after the bombs stop falling. The sources talk about looting, criminals taking advantage of the chaos. There's a story about a couple who are terrified that their home would be ransacked while they were evacuated.
Right. It just adds another layer of vulnerability to a situation that's already incredibly dire. It's not just about surviving the airstrikes, it's about protecting what little you have left, holding on to some sense of normalcy when everything around you is falling apart. It really speaks to the breakdown of social order that can happen during a conflict, how easily things can spiral out of control.
And in the middle of all this, you have these incredible first responders risking their lives to help others. We talked about terror, fire, losing his home, but his whole team had to evacuate their base because it was a potential target. They're living in a car park now, far from their families and the very homes they're trying to protect.
Yeah, it's really a testament to their dedication, their selflessness, but it also highlights the difficult conditions they're working under, right? Lack of equipment, constant danger. They're dealing with the same trauma and displacement as the people they're trying to help.
Of course.
One of the sources mentioned that the Lebanese Civil Protection Organization, which is responsible for coordinating rescue efforts, is completely stretched thin, struggling to cope with the scale of the disaster. They're relying heavily on volunteers, many of whom are untrained and ill-equipped.
And even with the best intentions, it's hard to imagine how they can keep up with the sheer number of people who need help.
Oh.
Over 1 million displaced, remember?
Yeah, it's a massive humanitarian crisis unfolding right in front of us.
Absolutely. The sources describe makeshift shelters popping up all over Beirut, families crammed into schools, mosques, any space they can find. The government's trying to provide assistance, but the needs are just overwhelming. There are concerns about shortages of food, water, medicine, and basic sanitation. And then there's the question of what happens next. How do you rebuild a city, a community, when the foundations have been so completely shattered? I mean, we see these images of children building little shelters out of polystyrene, trying to create some sense of normalcy in the middle of all these ruins. It's heartbreaking. But it also shows this incredible human spirit, this refusal to give up even when everything seems lost.
Absolutely. There's this resilience that shines through all these stories, this determination to survive, to create some semblance of order in a world that's been turned completely upside down. But we can't just focus on the immediate crisis. We have to think long-term. What happens to these families weeks, months, even years down the line? What of their education, their livelihoods, their mental and physical health?
And what about the emotional scars, the trauma of experiencing war, losing loved ones, being forced from your home? I mean, those wounds take a long time to heal. And the sources we have only scratch the surface of what these people are going through on an emotional level.
It's a complex issue. And it's important to remember that this conflict's impact will be felt for generations to come. This isn't just about rebuilding buildings, it's about rebuilding lives, communities, a sense of hope for the future. And that brings us to the question of responsibility. Who is accountable for this destruction, for the displacement of so many people, for the shattering of so many lives?
It's a tough question, and one that our sources don't necessarily have a clear answer for, but they do make it clear that this conflict is having a devastating impact on the people of Beirut, and that the need for humanitarian aid and international support is critical.
One of the sources mentions a report from a human rights organization that accuses both sides of the conflict of violating international law by targeting civilian areas. They call for an independent investigation and for those responsible to be held accountable. But accountability is just one piece of the puzzle. We also have to look at the root causes of this conflict, the complex political and historical factors that have led to this point. And we need to ask ourselves, what can be done to prevent this from happening again?
It feels like we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much more to unpack, so many layers to the story, and honestly, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of it all, the sheer human cost.
It's true. But it's important not to turn away. We have to engage with these issues. Listen to the voices of those who are affected. Seek out diverse perspectives. The sources we've explored today offer a glimpse into the reality of war, but they're just a starting point. It's up to each of us to continue learning, to stay informed, and to find ways to contribute to a more peaceful and just world.
It is. It's a lot to take in. And, like with any deep dive, we're only seeing a fragment of the whole picture, right?
Right.
Countless other stories, perspectives, we haven't even touched on them.
True. But I think what's so valuable about these particular sources is they really force us to confront the human reality of this conflict. We're not just talking about abstract geopolitical issues, we're talking about people's lives, like
Oh,
really being torn apart.
absolutely. These stories, they stick with you. Like that firefighter, he earned the nickname Fire because he pulled this young girl from a burning building,
Why?
risked his own life to save hers. Or the kids trying to make some kind of normalcy for themselves, building these makeshift homes out of polystyrene in the rubble. Those images are powerful reminders of what war really costs in human terms.
Yeah. And they challenge us to think beyond just the immediate crisis, to consider, the long-term impact on Beirut and its people. What will their lives be like in the months and years to come? How will they rebuild physically and emotionally? What scars will this conflict leave behind?
And what about the role of the international community? What can we do to support these rebuilding efforts? Are we doing enough to provide humanitarian aid, to work towards a lasting peace?
These are questions that demand our attention for sure. This deep dive has given us a starting point, but it's crucial to continue exploring these issues, seeking out diverse perspectives, engaging in meaningful conversations about what's happening.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of it all, but I think what these stories ultimately show is that even small acts of compassion, of understanding, can make a difference.
Right.
Donating to a relief organization, raising awareness, or just listening to the stories of those affected. These are all ways that we can contribute.
Exactly. And as you continue to follow this situation, remember those individual stories we talked about today. Remember the firefighter who lost his home but never stopped working to save others. Remember the children trying to build new lives amidst the ruins. Their resilience is a testament to the human spirit, and their stories remind us of the importance of hope even in the darkest of times.
Yeah. This has been a powerful reminder of the human cost of conflict. It's challenged us to think critically about the situation in Beirut, to empathize with those affected, and to consider our own role in working towards a more peaceful and just world.
And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring these issues, seek out those diverse viewpoints, and engage in thoughtful dialogue. Because ultimately, it's through understanding and empathy that we can begin to build a better future for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.